leather is easily the most misunderstood component of furniture. You know, you got folks like Ashley who are selling bonded as leather, where you're not even actually touching leather, and it's really not that hard. It's a really simple. It's far simpler than fabric or many other coverings. Just for whatever reason, it seems to be misunderstood. Hopefully, we can break some of that down. So today, the goal of today is to teach you the different types of leather, teach you how you get to the different types of leather, and talk about the features and benefits of each. So more family-friendly leathers, more eclectic leathers, and we'll go through all of that. If you have questions throughout, just go ahead and ask. I really do wing this, so your questions can help direct where we end up. Okay. Throughout human history, I haven't told this joke in a long time, so I don't know if it'll go over well, but leather making is truly the world's oldest profession, because it was also the first currency. So before the purported world's oldest profession could happen, you needed payment, and that payment was in leather. Leather's interwoven into the fabric of the human experience. Cavemen needed it. First of all, anyone who ate, there was a byproduct of the food, and it provided shelter, it provided warmth, and it was a key component to early civilization. The Indians used to make leather. How they would do it is they would hunt and kill an animal. They would boil down the fat, dig a hole, take the hide and put it in the hole, cover it in fat, cover it in dirt, and a year later they'd come back and it would be a non-perishable product. Today, that entire process takes a little bit more than 72 hours with all the different chemicals that are used. Okay? So I would start by saying that leather is a byproduct of the beef industry. No cows are killed for their hides, none. So there's no concern that you're responsible for the death of a cow. The cows are rendered for their beef. The leather is actually a byproduct or a recycled product of the beef industry. Okay? So let's talk about moo to you. Where does it start? It all starts in the slaughterhouse. The slaughterhouses are awful. But typically and historically, tanneries would be right across the street from the slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was they would render the animals, the skin would be removed, and they'd go across the street and it'd be immediately tanned into leather. Because of the world dynamic, that's changed. Black & One Leather Company was America's last major tannery. They went out of business in the year 2000. Since that time, all the American hides are essentially shipped offshore. So what happens is the animals are rendered for their beef. The hides are salted. And just old-fashioned, they just cover them in salt, throw them in a container, and either ship them to Italy, South America, or mostly these days China. Okay? So now we're in China, and we've just gone on a voyage across the Pacific, and it's taken 2 weeks in the heat, in the moisture of the ocean, and these hides are starting to decay. So when they open that container, it is truly one of the most disgusting things you'll ever see.
What about
because
the
it
smell?
smells, and it needs to be turned into a non-perishable product. Okay? So the hides are brought out, and they're put into what's essentially a 2-story dryer. Think of your dryer at home. It's called a mill, and it's about two floors high, and it'll hold anywhere from 100 to 200 hides at a time. Those hides are put into the drum, and then without making this a chemistry experiment, essentially they put industrial strength Nair in there with it. And what that does is it melts all the fat, it gets rid of all the hair, and then the hides come out then they put the chromium in, and the chromium turns it into a non-perishable product. The chromium also turns them a light blue, like it's Carolina sky blue, and that's why hides in that form are called wet blue. They're wet and they're blue. As we go through this, it's not real high-tech vernacular that we use in the leather business. So at that point, they're graded. And what that means is all the hides are laid flat on a grid, and people go through and look at them, and they determine how many flaws are on the hide. So all hides have some flaws, and those flaws could be barbed wire marks, they could be urine burns, they could be butcher marks where the butcher actually cut through the skin. All of those things are legitimate flaws, and the hides are graded based on the number of flaws they have. So the ones with 5 or less can become anlins. 5 to 10, probably semi-anlin. Any more than that, you're going to be pigmented leather. And people love to talk percentages, and I use it because it kind of helps, but it changes from shipment to shipment. But just, let's say, approximately 10% of all the hides made can be turned into aniline leathers. About 40-50 can be semi-aniline, and the rest have to be pigmented. Okay? At this point, it's kind of cool to make the comparison from leather to diamonds. Anilins, you do less to an anilin leather than you do to a semi-anilin or pigmented, but it costs way more. Why is that? Well, if you've ever bought a diamond ring and you go in, you could buy a carat ring for X, let's say 1,000, or you could buy one for far more than that. It's all based on the color, the clarity, and what's the other one? Cut. What is cut? There you go. Same is true with leather. What's that? No, I haven't. And yes, no, I have not. No commentary from there. So they grade them, and then they decide what they're going to make out of them. So you can be an anilin, you can be a semi-anilin, you can be a pigment. And then at that point, all leathers are aniline dyed. People love to ask, oh, is this dyed all the way through? Oh, is this aniline dyed? All the leathers are aniline dyed. There are some in the shoe industry where they just top dye them, but if it's furniture leather, it's aniline dyed the whole way through. So when people are like, oh, well, this scratch and the color underneath is different, it wasn't dyed the whole way through. That's not the case. Typically, you use a lighter color crust, and then you put something a little darker over the top. So if you scratch through the paint or whatever you got going there, you're going to see a lighter crust. Doesn't mean it's not made correctly. That's just how it's made. Okay. So at that point, they're aniline dyed. There's probably about 9 different aniline colors. You do black. You do russet. This is the most popular because you can make brown out of russet. Burgundy, blue, green, basically any leather color. You want a correlating color underneath. Okay. So once they're crusted, or once they're aniline dyed the whole way through, the rubber hits the road. It's time to make leather. Okay. So let's talk about the 3 major categories of leather. We did this in the meeting, but for the benefit of the video, I'll do it again. There are basically 3 types of leather: pigmented, semi-anilin, and anilin. In order to understand that, you first need to understand the difference between top grain and full grain. All the leathers Flexsteel sells are top grain, and all that means is comes around. No swear. Okay, no problem. What makes you think no swear? In any case, the cowhide's about this thick. So what they do is what's called splitting, and that's where you get the term split that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So they put it through, and it's called a splitting machine. And what happens is you take the hide out and you put it through this machine that has razor blades, and it literally lops off the top, and that's the top grain. Why is the top grain more desirable? Because if you look at it at the molecular and microscopic level, the cell structure is very tight and it's unidirectional, okay? Just like with plywood. The reason that's desirable is it's the strongest part of the hide. The further you go down within the hide, you get a looser cell structure, and it's a less unidirectional, so it's easier to tear. It's got less tensile strength. That's why you can use splits on out arms and out backs, because they take no tension. But you would never want to put a split without something to help it on anywhere that has tension, because it wouldn't hold up. So top grains, everything Flexsteel sells is a top grain. The only leathers that aren't really top grains these days are the bondeds, and the die-cast type leathers. And all of those, in every case, you never touch the leather. So let's talk about bonded real quick before I get into the other guys. Bonded, when you make a leather sofa, you get a yield of about 70%. What that means is you're paying for 100% of the leather, and 30% of that is falling on the floor, scrap. That scrap is typically sold off. And in bonded leather, they buy the scrap, they pulverize it into essentially a sawdust type product, and then they glue it to the back of a fabric. So when Flexsteel was buying those, it was making me crazy, because you don't touch leather, but Flexsteel don't call it leather, but Ashley does every day. It's not leather. It is a fabric where you've adhered with glue and leather waste to the back. Why do people do it? And it does add heft. It adds heft to the fabric. And if it's over 17%, thanks to a guy named Alan Nannis, who's now retired, who lobbied Congress, you can call it a leather sofa. Why the furniture industry insists on taking something of value and demeaning it at every level makes me crazy. And that's why I want to work for Flexsteel, because we don't do those types of things. Okay? So I've given you the disclaimer about the bad stuff. Let's talk about the 3 types of leather. Pigmented. Let's talk about pigmented first. Pigmented leather is leather that is sanded, embossed, or stuccoed, which is essentially like Bondo for your car. They can fill in holes, they can emboss over it. It's stronger than the leather these days. The chemicals are terrific. Okay? So any leather where you abrade the top or adulterate the top in any way, that's immediately going to be a pigmented leather. It immediately goes into that category. You can use lower grade leathers in pigmented. Why? Because you're sanding off the imperfections. You're embossing over the imperfections, and then you're painting over all of that. So you can use the lowest grade leathers. And back to the diamond scenario, that's why it's the least expensive leather. Okay? So let's talk about advantages, pros and cons of pigmented leather. Well, one of the advantages is it's the cheapest. One of the other advantages, it's also in many cases, the most protected. So it's very family friendly, it's great on motion because it can take friction, all of those things are terrific. What's the disadvantage? Well, the major disadvantage is it's firmer. The more you do to the leather by embossing it, heat and pressure, tons of paint, stucco, all those things are firmer. So you get a firmer leather. So that's why when you're comparing better leathers to like lower end motion, you feel that stuff, it feels like a polyurethane. And that's because there's so much paint over the top to cover the low grade imperfections. That's what makes it firmer. Okay, so advantages, family friendly. Disadvantages, it's firmer. And we feel at the retail level in leather, the triggers of our emotion are hand and color. If it's soft, it's got a ooh la la appeal, and does the color attract the person, right? So that takes us to semi-anilins. A semi-anilin leather is a pigmented leather, painted. Pigmented just means paint. It's just a fancy way to say paint. We don't want to say it's a painted leather, so we say it's a pigmented leather, okay? A semi-anilin is a full grain that has been painted. The best example in our line is Alfresco 016. That is a terrific leather. 014, thank you. 014. It's super soft and it's got a full grain. And you can tell, anyone can tell if it's a full grain or embossed leather simply by looking closely at the piece. And we can do it a little more in motion because it's a little more dramatic. But if there is a variance in the grain throughout the piece of the furniture, it is a semi-anilin. Because if it's embossed, it's a man-made grain and it's going to be exactly the same everywhere. If you look at it, if you guys remember the Dillon, on the Dillon, sometimes you get shoulder areas that had much looser grain in certain areas. That's part of the natural beauty of leather, and that's what makes it authentic, okay? So, pigmented, embossed, sanded, painted, semi-anilin is just a painted leather, okay? So it's more natural, but you get the benefit of the paint, which covers any imperfections. So you still are at a little bit lower price than you would be any anilin because there's more of that leather available. Okay? Finally, anilin. And I did this in our meeting, but I'll do it again. The fundamental difference between, now I'm going to take pigmented and semi-anilin and put them in a bucket together. We're going to separate that from anilin. Imagine I have two pieces of wood in my hand. One's painted and one is stained. Okay? The painted piece of wood is either a pigmented leather or a semi-anilin leather. When you look at it, what do you see? You see paint, right? You can go to Home Depot and have it matched exactly, no problem. You can buy Pantone and get exactly what you want. When you look at the stained wood, what do you see? You see the wood, you see the grain, you see other variants as well. For example, different types of wood take stains differently based on how porous it is. So if you have two types of wood and you stain them both, and they're different species of wood, they can be slightly different colors. The same is true with hides. So for example, anilin leathers will vary within the hide and they will vary from hide to hide because it's all dependent upon how the dyes and stains are taken up by the leather. An example, and this is don't mean to be crass, but if we were to tan all of us, everybody would come out a slightly different color based on your ethnicity, based on your life experience, based on your sex, and based on your age. The same is true with cows. So with anilin leathers, you're going to see it all. You're going to have variances, and that's part of the natural beauty of it all, okay? Additionally, when I said you saw the grain of the wood, when you look at some of these anilin leathers, if you look at them closely, and we can do this later on other pieces, but if you look real close, you see these lines here? Can you guys see that? Or right here, can you see the lines? Those are neck wrinkles. So when you're a cow, you spend your whole life basically doing this. And the back of your neck wrinkles over time. Okay, so when we chop that up and put it on a piece of furniture and it's not painted, you're going to see it. You're going to see stretch marks in cows. You're going to see some other less fortunate things like urine burns and barbed wire marks and things along those lines. Okay? Does everybody get the differences? Oh, by the way, typically stuff like the urine burns is cut out and doesn't end up on the furniture. Just so everybody, rest assured, it is as descriptive as it can possibly be. Yeah, it's exactly what it says it is. And when you're a cow, especially in the slaughterhouse, it's a little rough. You have a rough life, and some of that is offshoots of that. Okay. So real quick, let's talk about countries. There are basically 4 parts of the world that produce all the leather, and that's because those are the beef-consuming countries, okay? You go over to China and they're making a bunch of leather, but they don't eat a lot of beef. Even though there's 1.6 billion of them, there's not a lot of cows over there. So the hides are imported, okay? They can come from 4 regions, and I'm going to tie the 2 regions together. First is South America, and the second one is Australia. Those are the rougher hides. Those are going to be pigmented, or at very best semi-animal. And the reason for that is they're very rough hides. Why is that? Well, let's talk about South America. In Brazil specifically, which is the largest producing country, leather country in South America, barbed wire is how they encage the animals. They don't feed them great. They're not a super wealthy society. The animals don't eat real well, so they're not as big. Pesticides are illegal, so bug infestation is very common. And last but not least, they love to brand stuff. You know, it's a point of pride with these ranchers that they got their brand on cows. And it's not unusual in South America to see a cow that's been branded 3 and up to 4 times because it's changed hands. And every time it changes hands, they want to put their name on it. It's a symbol of pride. Okay? All those things are negatives when you're trying to make leather. Okay? In Australia, to a lesser extent, very similar. They're fed a little better, they live a little longer, but they're also very rough. Okay? So pigmented semi-alien leathers come from typically South America, and more so now Australia because of all the leather coming out of China. Okay? Let's talk about America. In America, we love us some beef. And anybody who's ever driven from Los Angeles to San Francisco has driven past that cattle ranch about halfway there, and you smell it 5 miles before you get there, and then you could walk across the head of cattle for 5 miles, and you smell it 5 miles after. Okay? But what we do in America is a number of things. First, we ear tag instead of brand. Okay? Secondly, we use electric fences instead of barbed wire, so there's not going to be far less scarring. And then finally, we fill them full of steroids so they grow real fast. They don't live real long, but they're real big, and that's super desirable in leather. When we're doing walkthroughs and Jenny mentions, oh, this is a real big piece of leather, understand that's a big deal when it comes to quality of leather. Look at the cheapest leathers. You're going to see seams everywhere. You're going to have seams in the back, you're going to have seams on the seat, you're going to have seams all over the outback. Why is that? The smaller the piece you use, the bigger the yield you get. And as I said before, when 30% of it falls on the floor, that's a big number. You know, an average hide costs about, let's just say $100 to make it round. 30% of that, $30, is waste. So when you chop it up, you can get it up to 75, 78. You're saving a little money. Okay, so there's value added to bigger pieces of leather. Plus, it's more visually appealing. Okay? So that's why American hides are the most desirable. Real quickly on Europe, it's basically Germany, the Scandinavian. You all saw The Sound of Music. It's a niche business. Every farmer has 20 head of cattle. They live in the open-air basement. They're treated great. They're fed well. They live very long lives, and they're super clean hides. And they're the most expensive. It's very rare to get European hides on American furniture these days. Okay? But I'm going to use examples of stuff in our line. The Dillon, Smith & Wesson leather. That leather was from a slaughterhouse in Wisconsin called Packerland. And we made a deal with them where we bought all their hides and we shipped them to China on that smelly container we talked about. And that's how you make better leathers, because they have to be clean. And the Packerland leathers were super duper clean. South America, you make products, well, like Sonnet would be the nicest one, which shows you how much the leather technology's moved on. But typically, it's the firmer, heavily embossed leathers that end up from the South America. Does everybody kind of get that? I don't know how that really translates to retail, but it just kind of explains how you get to the end product. Okay? Does anybody have any questions so far?
Doing good.
Nothing? Okay, so we understand semi-aniline, we understand pigmented, and we've talked about aniline. Let's talk about the subdivisions of that. From anilines, you can have a pure aniline. A pure aniline, in the truest sense of the form, if you guys remember, was it 954 or 957? Remember that killer leather we used to have from Elmo? Mm-hmm. That was a pure aniline. That was a leather that was just dyed and shipped. And it would fade in a cave, it would stain if you looked at it cross-eyed. It got it dirty immediately. But they were the most beautiful, luxurious leathers. Those don't exist in American furniture today. For one reason, they're about $5, $6 a foot. Flexsteel's average cost per foot of leather could be $2.50 to $3. So they're very expensive. They stain too easily, so they're not practical, right? So pure anilines in the truest sense don't really exist anymore. That's why we use the stain, the stain example to explain. If you can see into it and it's transparent, we're calling it an aniline, and we can still put stain protectant over, and it's family friendly. So we kind of bastardize the definition for the furniture use. So once we're at aniline, you have pure anilines, then you have oil pull-ups, you have wax anilines, you have nubucks, and those are basically the most common. Nubucks there's not a lot of nubuck out there because they stain so easy. When you slightly buff the top of the leather, anything will dive down into it. So nubucks are beautiful, everyone loves them, but they are the least family-friendly leather available. So there's not a ton of those out there. When you impregnate a leather, like this has wax in it, when you impregnate a leather with wax or oil, you're adding a little bit of stain protection by default. But what that does is it gives you a pull-up. Again, I had mentioned that in the leather business we don't use real high-tech terminology. You call it a pull-up because when you pull it, it lightens up. We could have called it pull and lighten up, but we're probably too lazy. But that's really what it is. It gets lighter, and this is, see how just by doing that, it lightens up a little bit. Now overnight, even though this is a wax, it'll migrate back. Nature abhors the vacuum. So unless it's a super hard wax with a huge explosive burst, they will return, especially on oils like the guy we have over there. If you scratch it, and as long as you don't rake it with your fingernail and break the epidermis, on an oil leather, all you gotta do is add a little heat, and the heat heats up the molecules and they return. So that's part of the natural beauty of these types of leathers. All of them will patina. And what patina means essentially is just how it's going to age through use. With proper care and maintenance, a leather like this will become more beautiful and more interesting looking through use and time. I compare them to a baseball mitt or a bomber jacket, where you buy them and they only get softer and better with time. This is this type of leather. With pigmented and semi-aniline leathers, they're made to look exactly the same from the day they arrive in home, for the next 30 years. Now, obviously, there's going to, they stretch a little bit and things like that happen, but they're made to look the same. Anilines are actually made to evolve. They're kind of almost like living and breathing. If you care for it properly, wherever you sit is going to get lighter. Wherever there's no tension, it's going to stay dark, and it's going to become more visually interesting through time. Okay? Everybody get that? One other thing I want to talk about is we have a couple very cool vacuum dried leathers in the space. What is vacuum drying? This is an important thing. When you make leather, typically what you do is you put it on a frame and toggle it. They pull it real tight on a big old frame, and then they put it going through vertically through an oven. And that oven heats and dries the leather. That's the last step of the process of making leather. But when you do that, you stretch it. So back to the microscopic level, the fibers are standing up like this, and all of a sudden you stretch them and they go a little bit like this, and you heat them and they flatten out. Okay? Doesn't mean the leather's not soft, it just means the fibers are flat. When you do a vacuum dried leather, it's a big machine, and you lay a hide flat, and you put this machine down on top of it, and from the top and the bottom, the moisture is sucked out. Vacuum dry. What that does is it gives you a fiber stand. So instead of laying flat, it stands up straight. And that does two really important things for you. The first is when you feel it, go feel that guy right there, because it's the best example when you have a minute. Just touch it real softly. It's got a bounce to it. What that is, what that bounce is this. You don't see it because it's too small, but it's there. And it adds a little softness and some tactile interest to the leather. Okay? Then that's really cool. The other thing that it does is when you apply stains to a vacuum dried leather, it's almost like applying stains. Instead of applying them to a canvas, imagine you're almost applying them to like a broom almost. You see with all the straw? It dives in. And by diving in, you get a depth of color. You get a three-dimensional look. It's like looking at a stained glass window or still water. And that's really the height of cool leather. When you see into it, and there's like a dimension to it. And that's what we go for in all leathers they make. So with anilines, it comes pretty easy. With semi-anilines and pigments, we play games. Like on Alfresco 014, we hand rub it in two colors to try to give a dimension. Or on lower grade leathers, you paint it, you put it through a spray booth that lays the hide flat, it's got 12 heads of paint on it, and you intermittently don't paint areas, and you paint other areas. And that happens. People like to use the word sauvage. That also shows the two-tone. Sauvage is just French for savage. So it's not a special word, it's just something we picked up. Like I said, in the leather business, we're all from North Carolina. So it's not like we're using a crazy vernacular. So sauvage is just means, it's French for savage. And that's just a way of talking about two-tone. More aggressive two-tones are called sauvage. More subtle two-tones are not. Okay? There's two ways to do that on pigmented and three ways to do that on pigmented and semi-aniline leathers. The first is you put it through a Kayla printer. A Kayla printer is like a newspaper printer. So like if you've all seen the things that, back in the day when there was a big headline, the New York Times, they would show that machine just printing paper. That leather's stained the same way. You put it through, and it's on a roller, and it applies a pattern to the leather. The second way I already mentioned, which was the paint machine, which goes through, and the third way is hand rubbing. Okay? Kayla's and the paint machine are inexpensive ways to do it. Hand rubbing is a very expensive way to do it. Back to the Dylan leather. When you hand rub the Dylan leather, two people, it took them 45 minutes to rub one hide. Oh. It took 4 hides to make a Dylan sofa. Okay, that's 6 hours of labor. You can't do that in America anymore. That's why that business went to China, because of the labor costs. They could actually, when you're in China, the more hands, the more labor, the more time you put in the leather, the greater value you create, because you're leveraging the fact that the labor costs are lower. Okay? Does everybody get that? That's basically the gist of the different leathers. I talked about how pigmented is the most family friendly. Let's talk about the features and benefits of semi-aniline and aniline. I'm going to talk about aniline first, and then we'll meet in the middle. Anilines are the most beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm pacing. Anilines are the most beautiful leather. I mean, they're cool, they're interesting, they're like a snowflake, they're super unique. People who aspire to better things would aspire to a aniline leather. They just look like money, and they're obviously the most expensive because the hides are the most rare. Okay? The advantage, they're cool. They have a life of their own. They patina. You see the hallmarks of the trail. You'll see slight scarring. You'll see an occasional brand. But it's part of the natural beauty of the leather and what makes it real. Okay? Disadvantages of aniline leather is they're quicker to stain and they're quicker to fade. So you don't want to put it on a direct heat source, and you absolutely don't want to put it in front of a window because it will fade. Rocks fade in the sun. I used to tell everybody, we guarantee our leathers will fade in direct sunlight. Everything fades in direct sunlight. So if you have a leather sofa, the best thing to do is don't put it in direct sunlight, don't put it on a heat source, and if you have to put it in direct sunlight, they do sell the UV stuff you can put on windows, and it's gotten very cheap at Lowe's. Put that on there because it's just like putting sunscreen on your skin. It will, if it's a 50, it'll the sun will damage it 50 times less. So it's a real value. Okay. So that's anilines. Semi-anilines have really become the best of both worlds because products like, let's talk about Alfresco 1.4 again. They're very soft because it's a natural grain. You see the natural grain of the animal. They're all snowflakes. Every sofa grain will be very subtly different. However, when you chop them up and put them together, nobody's the wiser. But you can see some of the things, the marks of authenticity, the variance in the grain and things along those lines. Okay? But not only is it soft, but it's also super safe, super family friendly because they're protected. There's a top coat put on all semi-aniline leathers that is very durable. The thing about pigmented is they throw a ton of top coat on because it's not going to feel great anyway. On semi-anilines, there's a little bit less. So by the purest definition, pigmented, if you're going to just put it on your front porch and let your dog live on it, buy a pigmented leather. But for family use, if you want a soft, luxurious, comfortable, nice leather, semi-anilines are the best of breed because you really do get the best of both worlds. Okay? You can't have your kids eating pizza on an aniline, but they can eat pizza all day long on a semi-aniline. In many cases, it's just as soft. Okay?
Is the majority of our products semi-aniline?
Yeah, it is. The majority of the products are. There's a good amount of anilines, and I will say over the past 3 to 5 years, more and more. Really, they're doing a great job of bringing cool, eclectic looks. But the real money, the Fenwick leather, the Wicklow leather, those are all semi-anilines. And they're soft and they're durable. Yes?
637 leather is family friendly. It seems to be softer and thicker than most leathers.
Yeah. It's not a semi-aniline, it's pigmented. But it's a really, really good pigmented. In fact, that leather is the best pigmented leather that I've ever seen. And it represents killer value. So if you look at it real close, the grain's going to be uniform throughout. You're not going to see grain variance. But what they do is somehow they still keep it soft, and then they put that top coat on. And there's a lot of ways to make leather soft. You can do it mechanically by beating the crap out of it. There's a machine called a Baggio machine where you take the hide and you put it through, and there's about 20 what basically look like the ends of a baseball bat, and they just punch the hide. So you put it through and it's just beats the crap out of the hide. That's one way to make it soft. Another way to make it soft is in the tanning process. Let's talk about 014 or Smith & Wesson leather again real quick. Those are what is called a Korean garment tannage. Korean garment tannage, anybody who's ever had a leather jacket or leather pants, you know how soft that is? You're like, oh man, why can't furniture leather be that soft? Well, there's two reasons. The first is they're thin. The thinner the leather gets, the softer it becomes. That's not necessarily good for home furnishings. You don't want home furnishings leather to be less than 0.8 millimeters, okay? Normal weight of leather is 1 millimeter. A heavyweight leather is 1.2 to 1.4, and using Flexsteel vernacular, a super heavyweight leather is anything over 1.4, okay? So for example, with the Smith & Wesson leather, it's a 1.4, that's 40% heavier than the regular leather, okay? And you notice how on those leathers you get a real grain pucker? You know how there's more grain? We're talking about substrate on the fabric. That's a word we use in this because the thicker the leather, the more substrate you have on the flesh side, and that causes the hide to pucker more. So when you have the thicker the leather, the more grain you're going to see. The thinner the leather, the less grain you're going to see. Sometimes we iron out the grain. We talked about how you beat it up, and I'll get back to how you make stuff soft in a second. But after you beat it up and put it through an iron, it would flatten it out a little bit and give it a little sheen. So there's all different ways you can create different visuals on leather. Okay? So we talked about beating it up, we talked about chemically. The other way you can make a leather soft, and this is the best example for the Cade leather, is they put a high-end top coat with drag. So when you feel it, it's got that feel. It's like, wow, that's a nice leather. But what they're doing is they're using low-grade raw material, embossing it, not putting a ton of paint on, but enough paint to cover, and then they're putting the high-grade schmutz on it, or the top coat that has that hand. And it does two things. It makes it super durable, family friendly, protects it from staining, but it also gives it that real cool grabby hand. And that's how leathers changed from 15 years ago. Used to be pigmenteds were all firm. Semi-alans were okay and alans were better. Today, most semi-alans are the softest, and in that case, that's terrific leather. And it represents real value. And all of this is tech, even though they've been making hides for a bazillion years, the technology in the last 10 to 15 has advanced dramatically. And that's how we can have value leathers that feel so great. Okay?
So what's a con to a scenario?
Oh, thank you. There aren't any.
What was the question?
What we were talking about pros and cons. And I was talking about the pros of semi-allan, best of both worlds. Super protected, super soft, natural. The cons, really, that they cost a little bit more than pigmented, I guess. I mean, semi-allans are kind of the perfect leather if you have normal use, because you get the softness, you get the naturalness, and you have the hand, and it's protected. That wasn't always the case. So one other thing to think about is when I first started with Lackawanna, I would spend all my time trying to explain to people why leather was so much more than fabric. Because back in those days, you could buy a real nice fabric sofa for $7.99, and the average leather one was still about $24.99. There was a huge difference. So I get up in front of everybody and say, well, the home furnishings industry says the average sofa should last 7 years, and they also say that leather should last 4 times longer than fabric. Ergo, 28 years, and I round up to 30. But when you're buying a cover that's going to be heirloom quality, that's going to last that amount of time, why in the world wouldn't you put the proper undercarriage on it? And that's really where it all comes together for Flexsteel. I don't need to explain the construction story. I don't need to explain the spring story to all you guys. But if you're going to spend the money on leather, why wouldn't you buy the proper undercarriage? I mean, back in the day when I was doing this, we were talking about in the Tootsie, but you could put some of the stuff through a metal detector and it wouldn't go off. So why would you spend so much money on it? So it really is a value story. This is venerable furniture that you'll end up giving to your kids. And when you're talking about, especially the chairs you guys are in or a sofa like this, it's going to be more beautiful in 10 years than it is today. And it'll continue to get more beautiful and interesting and individual with use.